Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our two-part skills webinar series entitled How to Record Videos. This series aims to guide Conservation District staff and members on how to create compelling videos. My name is Katrina Stacy, and I am NACD's Communications Coordinator, and I am excited to introduce Tanya, who will be leading our webinar today. Tanya Span-Roche has interviewed numerous farmers, conservation district representatives, feed industry experts, and other soil health stakeholders. Roche also edited 100 episodes of the popular PBS show Maryland Farm and Harvest. Roche is an Emmy Award-winning producer and editor with over 20 years of production experience, and her work has received numerous Emmy Award nominations, Telly Awards, Sign Awards, Communicator Awards, and TIVA DC Peer Awards. Roche has served as adjunct faculty at both American University and George Washington University Documentary Center, teaching graduate students camera, audio, lighting, and editing. She earned a BA in film theory from UF and an MFA in film and video production from FSU. Roche led production of NACD's promotional videos and mini documentary and is assisting NACD's Soil Health Economics project, which consists of producer testimonials. If at any point you have questions for Tanya during her presentation, please submit those using the chat feature and we can get those answered for you. And with that, I will hand it on over to Tanya.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad you could join us today. Today, we're going to really focus on the post-production aspect. The first webinar, we focused on production and how to record various ways. And there was actually a homework assignment, which you don't have to show. There was no grading for that. But we're going to talk about what you would do with the clips that you recorded. So we're going to just jump right in and start talking about editing. As a professor, I often taught editing classes. And what I discovered was there was sort of a missing chunk of knowledge. People could take all kinds of classes on how to use specific software, you know, whether it's Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere or any other piece of software. And you could figure out like what the buttons were and you know, what they did. But my experience told me that there was a missing class that needed to be taught. So not just like how to push the buttons, but when and why to push the buttons. So I created what I call the missing editing class, which normally is like a 2-day workshop. But I've sort of summed it up into the missing editing notes for today to just go over some of the basics, and then we'll jump into an actual edit session. So I'm going to share my screen and hopefully everybody can see that. My first slide has a quote from Walter Murch, who's one of my favorite editors. I had the privilege of meeting him at the National Association of Broadcasters conference one year. He's edited numerous films over the years, and he's written a book called In the Blink of an Eye, which is wonderful. It's really good advice about editing. And this quote is just wonderful because it's completely true. Film editing is now something almost everyone can do at a simple level and enjoy it. But to take it to a higher level requires the same dedication and persistence that any art form does. And that's completely true. The tools are out there, just like recording video. Anybody can do it with a smartphone, and it looks pretty good and it sounds pretty good. The tools have been very democratized over the years. When I first started, you know, you had to have a lot of money to have actual video production tools and editing tools. These days you don't. So there's a lot out there, but not everybody knows how to use it well. So that's what we try to improve on. So this is just getting a little bit geeky here. What makes editing work is two phenomena. One is called the persistence of vision, and one's called the phi phenomenon. Because basically movies are an optical illusion. You're not seeing moving pictures, you're seeing 24 or 30 frames per second, and each of those frames is a still image, and they just progress ever so slightly. And basically when darkness follows a bright image, your eyes' light receptors retain the image they saw for a fraction of a second, and then when the next image comes along, it's like there was no gap. The phi phenomenon allows us to fill in what gap there might have been. And so the brain takes those two things and interpolates it and sees it as a moving picture instead of just a series of still images. So that's really geeky. But that's why editing works. That's why filmmaking works. So a little bit of history. Initially, when people started making movies way back when in the early 1900s, they would shoot their films in one long take. And there was no editing because movie making at the time was so new and it was such a cool phenomenon on its own that just seeing a moving picture was enough coolness. You didn't need to edit anything. Then as things progressed storytelling wise, they started doing in-camera editing. So they would shoot a shot here and then go shoot another shot and another shot. And then when they played it back, there was a sequence of shots together. And then we progressed a little bit further and you realize you could splice film together, rearrange the shots, and editing was born. And editing is really powerful. The cool thing about editing, though, is if the editor is doing their job really well, the viewer has no idea and is not paying attention to it. And that's good, because if you notice the editing too much, then the editor's doing a bad job. So this is more about scripted stuff, not necessarily nonfiction, but even, or I mean fiction, but even nonfiction is often scripted. Documentary might be scripted, a promotional video might be scripted, but there's different rewrites that happen. So you might start with a script like, hey, this is the video we're going to make, right? This so-and-so is going to say this, so-and-so is going to say this, and so on. Then you actually get out into the field and you record the videos and you're like, that doesn't sound right. That sounded really good written down, but it doesn't sound conversational. So you end up rewriting it a little bit. Or perhaps you see a really cool shot that you didn't anticipate. And you're like, oh yeah, let's get that cool shot, incorporate that into our production. And now you've changed it a little bit, but it's for the better. Then the final rewrite of a script is when you actually sit down to edit everything together. You have whatever was said by the person speaking, and you have whatever additional visuals you recorded to go with that. And now you're going to finally write it for the last time. And that's how you end up with your production. It may not look that much like what your original script started as, but oftentimes you get a lot of better stuff from that. And I love filmmaking as a collaborative effort as well. Certainly one person could shoot everything and edit everything and put it out there. But if you have other input, other people, giving their advice on things, it's really good to have another set of eyes. So if you do edit something, I often recommend having somebody look at it, because a fresh pair of eyes can give a lot of feedback that's important. One thing editors have a problem with is when you've been editing some video together and you're seeing it over and over and over again as you edit it, you sort of lose any kind of perspective on it. So another pair of eyes, always good. So basically, when you're editing a shot with another shot, there's 4 basic editing relationships. The 2 shots may have some similar graphic qualities, visual qualities, shapes, colors, stuff like that. They may have some rhythmic qualities, and that's like maybe how fast or slow you might be editing your shots together. There's spatial qualities, which is called the Kuleshov effect, which we're going to talk about in a second. And then there's temporal qualities. That's more for fiction films, like if you're doing flashbacks, or you're showing like something that happened previously, something that's happening at the same time, like parallel editing. So that's not really that common in nonfiction editing. All right, so graphic visual qualities, you might have patterns of light and dark. So my shot right now, I'm centered, but on the one side of me is a dark door, and the other side of me is a light wall. So if I was to edit some B-roll in here, it would be nice if there was light in the same, or lightness in the same spot and darkness in the same spot. That would be sort of connecting the shots visually. Lines and shapes, movement within the shot. See how I'm moving my hands. So like if I wanted to edit something and I'm moving this way, if the next shot starts with something in it moving that way, that would be a nice edit together. All right. So then rhythmic, that's kind of the pacing of your editing. And what's interesting is the quicker you edit, the more dramatic you make things. So if you're telling kind of a slow story, like let's say you're, Veterans Day is coming up, and let's say you're putting together a video about Veterans Day and, some tributes to people and something that's really meaningful, then you might have a slower pace in editing because you want it to be thoughtful and commemorative. Whereas if you're editing something about some brand new initiative that your organization's putting out, you might be excited and you want to get people excited. So you might edit a little quicker, and that adds to the excitement. Alfred Hitchcock was great for accelerated cutting. If you've ever watched a Hitchcock film, the pace would start slow and get increasingly quicker as the film went on to increase the tension. All right. Sometimes the pattern or the rhythm is also dictated by music. So let's say like, okay, I'm going to put together this 1-minute promo video and I want to put some music in there. The music could affect how quickly or slowly you edit as well, because you're not going to cut really quickly to a slower piece of music and vice versa. What I was talking about, the Kuleshov effect, was named for a man named Kuleshov back in early filmmaking days. And he did an experiment. He recorded a shot of an actor looking at the camera with sort of a neutral expression on his face. And then he intercut that shot of the actor with a little girl in a coffin. And he showed this to audiences, and they said, "Oh, the actor looks so sad." He took the very same shot of the actor and he cut it next to a bowl of soup. And the audiences said, "Oh, he looks so hungry." Same shot of the actor and cut it in with a shot of a woman sort of laying suggestively on a couch. And the audience said, "Oh, he's showing lust in his face." But it was the same shot of the same actor who was looking at nothing but the camera. So it was an interpretation. So when you cut one shot with another shot, you're giving them meaning. You're attaching them. You're creating a relationship. So sometimes you can have an unintended relationship right that way, and it doesn't pan out right. Like, oh, that's jarring or something like that. But just keep in mind that when you edit things together, you're giving them meaning and you're telling a story. Okay, so spatial relationships, that was the Kuleshov experiment. Another thing he tried was geography. So he would have an actor standing on a street in Moscow and an actor standing on the street in Washington, D.C., and have them looking at each other. And he would cut back and forth between the two. So cinematically, they were sharing space. But in reality, geographically, they were hundreds and thousands of miles apart, right? So different interesting experiments that the early filmmakers did, especially the Soviets. They were really big into the filmmaking editing experience to see what they could make audiences feel with editing. All right, so then temporal flashbacks and that relationship between shots. Again, maybe you're having a flashback to when somebody was younger, which you could do in nonfiction as well. Let's say you're talking about your experience with your property, and this property's been in your farm or in your family for generations. You might have pictures of previous generations working the same land. So that's sort of a chronological flashback there. And that can be very cool to see like this perspective, and maybe you have the exact same perspective as a historical shot. So those are kinds of relationships between shots that you might edit together. So then some basic cutting strategies. So this is Hollywood cutting, which, is sort of traditional filmmaking. Doesn't always apply to nonfiction, but the reason, they say the rules are there to be broken. So you kind of have to know the rules of continuity editing to be able to break them and do cool stuff with them. So editing literally cuts apart. And so with continuity editing, we're trying to develop rules to hide those cuts when we're putting the films together, because you don't want the audience member to be really engaged in your video and just noticing every time you cut the shot, like, oh, that's so jarring, because then they're not paying attention to what your message is. You can't take away from your message. Your editing needs to enhance the message, not distract from it. So in Hollywood editing, they try to stabilize the spatial and temporal, clarity of each scene. So there's something called a 180-degree rule. So basically, if you have two people talking to each other, the line between them, of them facing each other, is this 180-degree line. If you were going to have two cameras, you would want the cameras on both sides or on the same side of those two people. You wouldn't have a camera on one side and a camera on the other, because then you're breaking the line. In your screen, you're going to have somebody looking this way, and instead of cutting to the other person and they're looking this way, they would be looking the same direction. And that would be jarring because that doesn't look like they're talking to each other. A good example of this is like a football game. At a football game, the cameras are typically all on the same side of the field, because otherwise it's going to look like the team is running towards the wrong goal. Now we have, of course, these cool cameras that will like swing over the top, which is really neat. And if they do something like that, then you could break that 180-degree line by the goalposts and be able to see from the other perspective. But traditionally, the 180-degree rule is there. And if you've ever watched a video that just felt like it was weird, like, why is the ocean jumping different sides of the screen? They broke the 180-degree rule. They didn't have the cameras on both on the same side of that 180-degree line that's imaginary between the two characters or points of interest. So screen direction is part of that as well. If in one shot somebody's running this way, the next shot they should still be running that way. If you cut and they're running the other way, then it looks like they went back and forth, and that's confusing to your audience. Matching action. So I talk a lot with my hands, right? And so if I'm gesturing in one shot and then you want to cut to another shot and I'm not, that's going to be a little distracting because the action doesn't match. Continuity editing, that can be very important. And they have a whole position assigned to that in Hollywood films called the script supervisor. Eyeline matches are important. Again, talking about like if I'm looking this way, then the next shot to be something looking complementary back the other way. Cross-cutting or parallel editing is if you're telling two different stories within the same time period. Like maybe you're telling the story of this family over here, and then the story of their neighbors over here. You might intercut between the two. That gets a little more complicated. And that's, again, more narrative fiction. But the whole purpose of continuity editing is to preserve a realistic portrayal of events. Unless you're trying to do something really arty and out there, you really want it to feel real and authentic. Okay, determining your shot order. So typically, it's good to set up what they call an establishing shot. Like, where are we? Tell me what we're doing in this story. And then maybe you go to a closer shot and maybe even a close-up later. This kind of establishes where your character is and what their point of view is. And you can also do the reverse. You can start with a close shot, then go to a medium shot, and then go to a long shot. So you can do either way, but you should have some sort of establishing shot in there somehow. And the sooner the better to give your audience a sense of place. All right, scene transitions. Cutting on the action. Talked about trying to match your action and cutting on any sort of motion that might be happening within the frame. It could be a car driving by. It could be a person walking. I love what we call people wipes. So if you're shooting a scene, let's say you're interviewing somebody standing on a street and there's, people walking back and forth and whatever. If they're talking and somebody actually crosses in front of the camera, you can cut on that cross in front of the camera to another shot. And it's cool. It's what I call a people wipe. You can also have car wipes, boat wipes, van wipes, whatever, tractor wipes. But that's really cool. Those make for a neat transition that's very natural. It's still just a simple cut edit, but it feels a little bit fancier than that. Of course, nonlinear editing systems have all kinds of transitions in them. You can do wipes and slides and dissolves. But I like stuff to be motivated personally, because you can just get a little too heavy with transitions sometimes. So being able to do a cut is fun. All right. We talked about transitions. So there's straight cuts, which is literally just cutting. Fade in, fade out can show like a passage of time. Maybe if you're telling an intergenerational story, you might fade to black and then fade back up. A dissolve can also show a passage of time, or it can just create a smooth connection between two shots. A fade to color, like a dip to white, is often used if you're editing sound bites together to show that there was a little bit taken out. A long dissolve to white often can show something spiritual or imply something like that. Typically, you don't fade to black unless you're trying to show like a long passage of time or like you're ending or beginning. Audio is also a fantastic transition from one scene to the next. Often you might hear the audio of a shot before you see the picture. It could be a dog barking, it could be a piece of machinery, but that can do a seamless transition to take you into another scene. Let's say we're going from over here talking about this to over there talking about a completely different topic. If there's sound related to that second topic, have a little hint of that come in before, and that helps smooth the edit. All right, back to my buddy Walter Murch. He has a rule of 6. And this is what I think he just randomly assigned percentage values. But basically, he's talking about how important each thing is to your edit. So he says emotion is the very most important thing to your edit. As long as the emotion's there, that's the biggest factor. Second is story. Third is rhythm. Fourth is eye trace. And then we get to 2-dimensional plane of screen and 3-dimensional space of action. Those are much, much less important. So what's funny, though, is that the 2-dimensional plane of screen and the 3-dimensional space of action, that's what a script supervisor or continuity supervisor is going to be most concerned with. But he says that those are very insignificant. So if you've ever been watching like a TV show and you catch a continuity error, like, oh, the actor's arm is up in one scene and not in the next scene, that's a continuity error. But hopefully you're so involved in the emotion of your story that you don't even notice that. And that's what the editors try to do. They have to make that judgment call. Like, yes, this doesn't technically match. It's, daytime over here and it's kind of evening over here. It didn't totally match, but the emotion's really good. So we're going to go with that. All right. So how to start paying attention to editing. Watching films with the sole purpose of looking at the editing. And a good way to do that is to watch it without sound. You can also sort of measure the tempo of the edits. You're like, oh, they seem to be cutting every 3 or 4 seconds. So that's a good way to start paying attention to the editing and kind of see what kind of edits you like and see if there's some cool edits that you could steal, because stealing, of course, is the greatest form of flattery. Subjective editing, it's a style that kind of makes you the participant. So you might have an establishing shot, and the actor looking, and then you insert what the actor's looking at, and then you return to their reaction. And that's a way to really tell a story that you're kind of following the actor through. Sometimes they'll create suspense and drama by not showing you what the actor's looking at. You just see the actor's reaction and you get a little anxious. And you're like, what are they looking at? This is more narrative, but it's kind of fun. It's a way to create emotion within your story. And I know I've been talking for quite a bit. Are there any questions so far? I'm going to get into a little bit more and then we're going to jump into an edit, but I wanted to stop and see if there's any questions so far. Okay, I'm guessing no. Cool. All right, so a little bit of editing advice. All right, this is a blog post that I found that I thought really summed up a lot of great points, so I stole it. And I've been using it in my classes for years. I hopefully it's still posted there. But one of the better tips for editing is to cut tight. So if you have somebody trying to tell a story, they may not tell it succinctly, like it's been scripted or anything. You know, if it's a real authentic interview, there's going to be pauses. There's going to be ums and ers, and like they just have to think for a second. And that's fine when you're recording and that gets across, you know, their genuine feelings. But when you go to edit, you might want to tighten some of those gaps and take some of the air out. And then you would cover it with your B-roll shots that hopefully you shot to go with it. Because an and an may not seem like a big deal in a conversation, but trying to watch it on video, it takes a really long time to watch. So this is talking about temporary music. So this is, again, more of a Hollywood thing, but it's something to keep in mind. So when you're editing like a movie or something like that dramatic, you might throw in some music to edit too, to give it sort of a sense of feeling while you're editing. But you can become really dependent upon that music while you're editing. It's better to edit your story together with no music. And if it stands alone and it's a strong story that you've edited well, it will definitely be enhanced by adding music later. But music can really overcome some weak editing. So if you get really reliant on a piece of music from the beginning, your story may not be edited quite as strong as you would like it to be because you're relying so heavily on the music. The complete exception to this is, of course, if you're doing a music video or something that you're relying on the pacing of the music to tell the story. And that might happen if you're doing something that has nobody talking. Maybe it's just you want to show a montage of shots, like from an event or something specific. Then you're going to edit to your music. You're going to edit to the pace of your music. And then you do need it initially. All right, moving camera shots. So moving the camera around can be really powerful because it can get really boring to just watch a static shot, especially if we're talking about anything in landscapes or in nature where perhaps there's not much moving except maybe the leaves on the trees, you know, maybe something in the background. If you can do like a zoom in, like a slow zoom in or a pan across, or maybe a tilt down from some interesting point, that really adds to the interest in the shots. And I know we're sort of jumping back to production when we're talking about that, but knowing how to be a good editor makes you actually a much better shooter. If you have to edit your own stuff, you realize, wow, I should have filmed that a lot differently and it would have edited together better. So moving camera shots are one of those things that is just wonderful. The editors love them. We always like to edit on motion. If you end up with a bunch of static shots, you can add fake motion in your post-production. You can add a slow zoom if you want, or even, blow up the shot and add a little pan or something like that. And that just can make it more visually interesting. I had to edit a story one time that was involving children on a playground, and the person shooting it shot just still shots, like didn't move the camera at all. And you have these kids running all over the playground. I'm like, oh, it would have been so great had you like panned and followed the kids. So that's my moving action bit of advice there. Okay, B-roll shots in threes. If you attended the first webinar, my homework assignment was to record about a minute, 30 seconds to a minute of a soundbite, and also 3 good B-roll shots. And nobody knows quite why, but 3 B-roll shots put together feels really good. It feels like you're telling a story. If I only put 1 shot in there, it feels like maybe I'm covering a mistake. 2 shots is okay, but 3 feels like I'm telling a story. So it's just sort of a common thought for editing to use 3 B-roll shots in a row. Okay, digital aids. This is what I was talking about, sort of faking a Zoom or something like that. Nowadays, we can record in 4K, even on our phones. If you record in 4K and then you go edit in 1080p, which is high definition, you can fake a close-up if you need to, which is really nice too. Like maybe I shot my shot too wide, or I want to edit 2 things together, 2 different parts of what I said. I can fake a close-up and that will cut together well with the wide shot. So in other words, you can't edit what wasn't shot, but you could try and fake it. Another way to do that is with graphics, and we'll talk about that in a minute. All right, any questions on that stuff? Okay. So just real quick sum up of that. Continuity editing, we have a 180-degree rule. So it's an imaginary line between me and whatever I'm looking at. And so any camera angles you want to have on the same side of that line. Matching action. Eye line match. Make sure if I'm looking at something, that something is looking back at me in a complementary direction. And then screen direction. You know, somebody's running one way, they need to keep running that way, unless you actually show them turning around and running the other way. So this is a little bit of a diagram of what I was talking about, the 180 rule. And you can see that the 2 participants form that 180 line. And so a camera can be on either one side or the other, but you shouldn't cut in between the 2. And you can have 2 cameras, you know, if you have 2 cameras that you're covering this with, maybe like a GoPro set up somewhere and then a phone somewhere else, just make sure they're on the same side of that 180-degree line. And excuse me. So your shot reverse shot, that would be, let's say that you're doing an interview and you're not only showing the person you're interviewing, but you're showing the person interviewing them. You would have a shot reverse shot. So I'm looking at my person that I'm interviewing and I have them, you know, maybe they're looking, it's better to look off camera if you're doing something like that. So they'd be looking ever so slightly off camera. And then your reverse shot, you have the other person looking ever so slightly off camera the other direction so that they'll cut together well. Okay, a reaction shot. Excuse me one second. If you are doing interviewing somebody else, or even just someone else listening, maybe you're interviewing 2 people and they're listening as each other is talking, it's nice to every now and then show a reaction shot of the person listening. They might be nodding or smiling or reacting to what's being said, but it gives it a real sense of conversation and makes it a little more personal. The problem is, if you don't think about it, you might not record that reaction shot. So news crews, when they go out, if they have a reporter interviewing somebody, after they finish the interview, they'll turn around and just record some shots of the reporter nodding that they can use to edit later if needed, because they might take only the beginning and the end of what somebody said, cut to a reaction shot of somebody nodding, and then keep going. All right. Rhythm and pacing. So we talked a little bit about pacing, which is like how quick your edits are. Are they 2 seconds apart, 5 seconds apart? Rhythm is internal to whatever it is you're editing. Going back to the thing about topics, if I'm doing something about, let's say, Veterans Day, my rhythm, it might be slower, right? It's just the topic is going to dictate something slower. If it's something thoughtful and poignant. If it's not, if it's something like really exciting, you know, we're doing a race or you know, a car chase or something like that, then the pacing, the rhythm of that's inherently going to be different. And your pacing needs to kind of match that. If you try to pick a pace that conflicts with the rhythm of the story you're telling, it's going to feel awkward to the audience. All right. So this is more tips on editing a documentary, which my definition of documentary is pretty loose. I think anything that's nonfiction is documentary. So shoot tons of B-roll. B-roll is what we talked about. The extra images to cover up your interview. And the term B-roll comes from way back when in early TV days, you had A-roll and B-roll. Your A-roll was whatever the person was saying, and the B-roll was anything that went on top because you only had 2 tracks. So the term is stuck around in case you wonder what B-roll actually means. But you can literally never have enough B-roll. And this is the problem with an editor going out on a shoot. It's like, I want all the shots, you know, give me more, because I like choices in the editing room. So tons and tons of B-roll. You never know, you know, that little sign or that little close-up or that cool low angle, all could be really useful. Organization is really, really important. if you're going to be sitting there editing this stuff, you need to be organized. You're not going to have time to be like, oh my gosh, I saw that cool shot, but what did I call it? Did I label it? Is it unnamed clip 3? Oh, so you got to be organized. That's important. Don't rush what you're doing. Try to take your time if you can. I mean, sometimes you have to turn something around really fast, and that's fine. But try not to rush it if you can. Try to give yourself time to properly view and absorb what you have. My problem with footage that I didn't shoot or that I wasn't there when it was shot is if I know I need a shot of this particular building, I'll just go until I find one that works. I won't go through necessarily all the footage to find the best shot. So if you have time, try to go find the best shots, because they may not be the first shot. Often they're the last shot. And then find your narrative. Any nonfiction story, any story you're trying to tell has a storyline to it. You just got to figure out where to start it and where to end it. It may not start with, hi, my name is so-and-so and I work for so-and-so and today we're going to talk about this. Maybe you don't need that part. Maybe you just jump in with, soil conservation is a really important issue and here's what it means to us and my family. Maybe that's your beginning part. You got to find where you're going to start, because sometimes you don't need quite as much introduction or summary as you think you do. It might be a tighter story if you begin it a little later or end it a little sooner. All right. Leave some things to the imagination. You don't need to get all your information out front. Maybe the information sort of unfolds as you tell your story, and that keeps the audience going on and interested. And utilizing real moments. That is totally key. You might say, okay, we're going to go out, we're going to shoot this video about this cool thing we're doing, and this is what we're going to do. But if something really neat happens that's really real, like something interacts with you in a way that was unexpected, those are great. Keep the camera rolling and try to get those, and maybe they're useful to your story. Watch good documentaries. There are lots out there these days. Ken Burns obviously made a whole career out of making documentaries, but watching them gives you a good idea. And then, don't just say, oh, I'm just shooting this stupid little video for whatever. Try to have fun with it. Try to make it more polished or learn something from what you're doing or try a cool technique. All right. Finding your theme or objective. That's a little bit for more long form stuff. But every promotional video has a call to action at the end. So in the way you structure your story together, let's say you're doing promotion for a product you're selling or an organization you work with, you're going to start with a story. You're going to try to grab the audience's attention. You're going to tell that story, but at the end, you need to end it with something what do you want them to do at the end of that video? Like, what's your call to action? What do you want that viewer to take away when they get done watching that video? And avoid over stylizing or under stylizing. I agree with this completely. Some things try too hard to be arty, and that is almost distracting in a way. It might be like sort of cool for a few seconds, but after a while you're like, this shaky camera thing or whatever is getting old and I don't like it. It's taking away from my story. Sometimes just the raw natural story is really what you need. And again, just make your editing as invisible as you can. And that is what's most powerful. Authentic is very, very, very important to people. Okay, so we're almost done with the PowerPoints, I promise. And we're going to get to more fun stuff. So different audio situations you might have to deal with. This is one of the big things you have to deal with in editing. Sometimes it's not great audio. And it could be because the person was standing next to something really noisy. Maybe you thought you had plugged in an extra microphone and hadn't. Maybe, you just ended up with the microphone off the camera. Maybe you just recorded it too low. Wearing earbuds or headphones is really, really important when you're recording something, if you possibly can, if you're using a camera that has an output for that, because then you'll know what you're getting and you won't get surprised later when you go back to play it and you're like, oh, wow, they were so far away from the microphone. It wasn't loud enough. Other things you might do in post-production besides just editing, you might do some color correction. So there's color temperature to all different kinds of light. Indoor light tends to be more yellow and orange. Outdoor light tends to be more blue when it's recorded by a camera. Your eyes don't notice it, but a camera does. And there's color temperature. Most cameras will automatically adjust and you don't even have to pay attention to it. But if you do have a camera that manually sets it, or if it changes while you're recording, you might notice that the color gets a little weird. So you might have to color correct for that. How to output and encode what you're doing too. Like, where is this video going? Is it going to YouTube? Because YouTube likes a certain set of encoding. Is it going to another platform or social media? The interesting thing is a lot of people will put stuff on Instagram, and Instagram uses like square video. So you don't even see like the sides of the video like you would on a television screen. So you have to think about that in your framing. Like, what is this going for? How do I encode this? And hopefully it's framed properly. Another big thing, of course, is closed captioning. If you're putting something out on social media, it's sometimes really good to have closed captioning files added to it, because how many times do people go through social media and they don't actually listen to any audio, but they'll read the words if they're on the screen of what the person's saying. So that's another part that can be important to the post-production process. All right, so done with the PowerPoint. I'm going to stop sharing that. And if there's any questions, I can take those now, and then we'll jump into an edit session. And I will share their presentation, yes. Any questions? Hopefully I didn't talk too fast. I know I nobody thinks I'm from Georgia because I talk too fast.
Doesn't look like we have any questions so far. Thank you, Tanya.
Okay, great. I'm going to hop into an edit session then. Let me share my screen. All right. So this is some footage that we recorded doing a video for NACD, and we didn't actually end up using it, but it was still really good video. And so I thought I'd use it for my part of the homework. So I have this nice young woman at a farm near us talking about soil conservation and what her land means to her. And I've selected a couple sound bites. So this is the platform that I use. This is Adobe Premiere. And this is the one I'm most comfortable with. I've also used Avid Media Composer, which is typically used like larger organizations with a lot of network drives. I used Final Cut Final Cut Pro for a long time, but when it moved to Final Cut X and it became more like iMovie, I stopped using it as much because I like this layout. So on the left-hand side, I have my preview window, basically. And on the right-hand side, I have my program window. And these are sort of leftover terms from TV days when the program is what's actually being aired. The preview is what's going to come up next. So that's kind of where that comes from. But I'll talk a little bit really quick about project organization. So I've got the name of my project. It's NACD 2017 because that's when we were filming these things. So I have a folder full of assets. And in here I have all different kinds of stuff. This RR farm is from the farm that we were recording. I also have some aerials and some combine shots. And I've created a sequence so far. So this shot in my preview side is actually the same shot as my program side, but we shot in 4K, and this is what I was talking about. So if you shoot in 4K, you have this nice big picture, but I was going to edit into 1080p. So if you see my sequence settings, 1920 by 1080, and I'm doing it at 2997 or 30 frames per second. They're very similar. There's a drop frame thing with broadcast, but for most videos, you don't need to worry about that. But when I lay it into my timeline, it's obviously blown up. So what I can do is I can shrink it down. So 4K is basically twice as big as 1080. So now if I wanted to cut her with another shot, I could do that. I have to move her down a little because I'm cutting her head off. But that and that would cut together. So they would be two different sound bites, but it's the same camera angle and it's the same interview. But because I've shot in 4K, I have options and I can make a wide shot and a close shot. So that's kind of nice. That's an advantage to shooting in 4K, although it does take up a lot more space on your memory card or your phone or whatever you're shooting on. All right, so let's really quick listen to what she's saying.
Locally led conservation is important to the farmers and landowners here in our area because the local conservation districts know the land best. Here in Maryland, we're often described as America miniature. So we have the mountains in the western end of the state to the oceans on the eastern end of the state.
Okay, that's a good out point. So I might cut there. All right, I'm gonna get rid of that stuff. Let's see what she says next. What's my other bite I selected?
Conservation is important to us because we want to protect the land. Farmers and landowners are often the best environmental stewards of the land because their livelihood depends on it. The land that we're standing on here today, this was given to Charles Carroll, who signed the Declaration of Independence by the Queen of England, and it has remained in that family ever since. And
wow, that's pretty cool. So she's making some good points, but she's a little hesitant, and that's natural. That's how people talk. But watching a video, that's not what you want to see, right? You want to hear it a little more polished. You may want to take out some of the gaps. So let's look at that. Let's see, what can we do here?
locally led conservation is important to the farmers and landowners here in our area because the local conservation districts know the land best.
So what I'm actually going to do before I even get to that, if you look at my timeline here, and not knowing, I'm sure everybody's coming from a wide variety of backgrounds as far as knowing how to edit anything. So my top track is my video track. Under that are 4 audio tracks. The camera we were recording with by default recorded 4 audio tracks. There's actually nothing on those last 2. They're blank. This little kind of sketchy thing, that's telling me what audio is on there. So I'm going to get rid of that. I don't even need those 2 tracks.
Described as American.
So you'll see that one track has a higher waveform monitor than the other. And that's probably because this is the microphone that she's wearing. And this is probably the microphone from the camera. But I can double check that. I'm going to turn off my microphone here.
Here in Maryland, we're
Oops. Okay. Nope. Sorry.
Here in
Let's try the mute button instead.
Maryland, we're often described as.
So that sounds pretty good. I'm going to mute the other one. That's really low. So I think that's the camera microphone, and that's not the one I want. So I can get rid of that.
The mountains in the western end of this.
And I can make her louder. All right, I'm going to bring her up. So if you do edit and you work with controls like this, audio gain, about 3 dB is a noticeable level of loudness. So if you raise something up about 3 dB or 6 dB, those are sort of like kind of notches for your ear. Like you notice the difference in loudness there.
To the ocean, landowners are often the.
Okay, so that's just a rough idea. All right, so let's look at our B-roll now. Because we've seen her on screen for a little bit. We might do a graphic where we name her. And so we'll leave a little time on screen for that. But then we want to kind of get into what she's talking about. We want to see this land she's talking about, right? We haven't seen our establishing shot yet. We know she's standing in a field. But let's see what else we have. So here's some footage shot from her farm that day. And so we got some cool combine stuff. We got some close-ups. We got a nice low angle. Ah, this would be good when she's talking about soil, right? Because that's where we're seeing the soil. So where is she talking about that?
Here in Maryland, we're often described as America miniature. So
okay. That's not where she's talking about the soil, but that's a good point to know too. Here in Maryland, so that'd be maybe our wide establishing shot. Let's see what this looks like here. Oh, a little unsteady until we zoom in. Okay, do we have the wide steadier shot? Maybe not. All right, let's see what's in our other bins. Ah, so if you came to our first webinar, I talked about using drones. Drones are so cool. They're loud, but they are cool. So we used a drone for this to get a really high angle shot of the field. And you can get all kinds of like sweeping shots. You can do very cool things with the drone. The problem is if it's a windy day, it is hard to control. So you got to be kind of careful with that. But you know, that could be a nice establishing shot. Maybe it's the drone shot. Now we don't want the audio of the drone because you're not hearing anything there. And me personally, how I like to edit is I like to put down my video track on the video 1, and then I put stuff on top of it. So I put my B-roll on top. So I kind of always know what's underneath. So now.
Know the land best. Here in Maryland, we're often described as America miniature. So we have.
That kind of worked. I like that. All right. So when you're editing without music or without like a certain pace already set by either the topic or whatever, I tend to edit my B-roll with phrases of what the person's saying.
The land best. Here in Maryland, we're often described as America miniature.
And that's the end of that phrase. So now, personally, I feel like I want another B-roll shot there. So what does she say next?
So we have the mountains in the western end of the state to the
mountains in the western state. Okay, so there, I don't have a picture of the mountains because this wasn't shot in the western end of the state. So maybe I either cut that out for now or I make a note to go find a shot of the mountains to put in there. All right. Let's move ahead to what she says next to see if we do have B-roll to cover that. There we go. Let's go to our cut point here.
Conservation is important to us because we want to protect the land. Farmers and landowners are often the...
She's got a big gap there. I want to take that out and cover that.
Farmers and landowners are...
Take that out.
Landowners are often the best environment.
So that sounded better, but now I have a visual cut there. So I want to cover that. I could do a little dip to white, but that gets sort of annoying and takes me out. If I can just cover it with B-roll instead, that would be more fun. Another thing we talked about in the first webinar was mounting cameras. So if you use a GoPro, they have these cool magnetic mounts that you can put the GoPro on and stick it to the side of any kind of piece of machinery that a magnet will stick to, and you can get some really neat perspective stuff. So it's not running there. Hang on, when did it start running? Oops, here we go. Somewhere it's going to start running. Come on. Here we go. So cool perspective shot. All done with a GoPro on a magnet on a combine. So pretty cool. So that might be neat to show landowners, right? We can try that. So how long do I want to hold it? She's going to start here.
Often the best environmental stewards of the land.
That's a nice phrase. And if you look at how long that is, it's about 2.5 seconds, almost 3 seconds. Most people like to see shots change every 2 to 4 seconds. It used to be like 5 to 7, but we have shorter attention spans these days. So 2 to 4 is a good length for a B-roll shot. All right, cool. What does she say next? Let's see.
Because their livelihood depends on it.
Their livelihood depends on it. Okay, so maybe I remember seeing a shot in my sort of organized bins here of somebody actually working. All right, we could put that in there. Oops, but I don't want the audio. So this is how you kind of build your story. Now I got to remember though that that stuff was shot in 4K. So I'm going to take that and I'm going to shrink it down. 4K is twice as big.
Stewards of the land, because their livelihood depends on it.
So we're starting to build a story. We're starting to tell a story. And this is what you do with your visuals. You figure out, what are they talking about? What relates to that? What can I show? So something else that was kind of cool she does, she talks about how long the land has been in the family.
Sign the Declaration of
Okay, so she's talking about
given to Charles
okay, here we go.
here today. This was given to Charles Carroll, who signed the Declaration of Independence. But
okay, so she's got a little stumble there, so we'll take that out too. And what I'm doing that you see this highlighted point is I'm setting an in point, and then I'm setting an out point. And basically this is called 3-point editing. You set an in point and an out point, and then on whatever your source material is, you also set an in point. So you set 3 points, and that tells the computer where to place the video. So that's 3-point editing, if you ever hear that term. All right, well, Charles Carroll sounds like probably an older person if he signed the Declaration of Independence. Fortunately, I was able to go to Wikipedia and find a picture of him. And fortunately, Wikipedia even told me that this is in the public domain under the Creative Commons license. So perfect, I can use it for my video. So I can show who she's talking about. Okay, but I don't want it over her. That's kind of weird. So I can make it a little bigger. And instead of her as a background, I also went and I found, oh, I thought I found a map. Where is it? Not that map. That's a really new map. Where's my old map? Here we go. Maybe. Somewhere I found a historic map. Yes. Okay, that's a really low resolution version of it though. But I can use that as a background. So exactly where I put my friend Charles Carroll, I can put this map. And since I'm just using it as a background, I can blow it up really big. So that map is actually like a historic map of the area that I went and got from the Library of Congress website in the public domain because of its age. It's already pretty blurry, but if I wanted to, I could add another blur. And so boom, I've just made a graphic.
On here today, this was given to Charles Carroll, who signed the...
But I am going to cover her little stumble there. So take that out. Make that a little longer.
Who signed the Declaration of Independence by the Queen of England. Independence.
And we're not talking about him anymore.
By the Queen of England.
So we can come back to her there. And if I want to get really fancy, I could even add a zoom. So I have some presets here that I created that's like to transform and zoom something in like 10% so that I don't have to set in and out points and do that, but I can show you that way too.
This was given to Charles Carroll, who signed the Declaration of Independence by the...
So that's kind of more interesting visually, right? Sometimes if you don't have B-roll shots, you end up just making some graphics and faking it that way. That was a preset that I had created that I used, but if I didn't want to do that, what's really cool is other kinds of in and out points. Whoops, went too far. So in each shot, I can set a keyframe. So I've double-clicked this to bring this back over to my source monitor, and I can set a position keyframe, a scale keyframe. I can go to the end of the shot and do the same thing, and this keyframing then allows me to adjust the parameters over time. So I started it, scaled up to 192, and it was in this position. So let's say at the end, I want to zoom it in a little bit. I'm going to make it like 225. But I'm going to lower it down a little bit because I'm starting to cut off his wig.
On here today, this was given to...
So now I've created the zoom a different way. Keyframes are very powerful. You can use them for lots of different things. All right, so I know I try to cram a whole lot into not much time. So if there's questions, I'm happy to take any questions. No questions? All right. I hope this is interesting. I hope you're getting stuff out of this because I'm feeling a little weird. There's no questions.
Tanya, we actually got a couple questions in the chat box.
Okay, great.
Okay, the first one, are GoPros pretty good at general cameras to use?
That is an excellent question. So the only trick with GoPros is because they're meant to do such a wide angle, you can sometimes get a fisheye effect. All right. And there are some cameras that you can adjust the angle. The wider the angle, the more of like the fisheye look you're going to get a really wide angle. For recording a person, you don't want that. You want something with a little bit narrower angle. So it depends on the GoPro. The newer ones have more features. The older ones didn't have as many features. So the other issue with the GoPro is I don't know if you can plug an external mic into it or not. So they can certainly be decent cameras, but maybe not the top choice for like interviews and stuff.
Okay, wonderful. And then another question is, do you need a powerful computer to edit?
That is another wonderful question. So yes, I am editing on not the newest MacBook Pro, but a really recent MacBook Pro. I think it's from last year. And it's got a really good graphics card in it and a lot of like speed and memory. Especially if you're doing anything that's 4K, yes, you do need a pretty powerful computer, and it's a lot about the graphics card and about the speed of the memory. As far as like hard drive space, you don't need that as much because you can always plug in external hard drives. But the graphics card, it could hold you back a little bit with 4K. If you're just doing like 1080 or even 720, you don't need as powerful. But people are really tending to shoot in 4K to sort of future-proof themselves. So the answer is yes. Sorry, you kind of do need a good computer.
Okay, perfect. And then someone's asking if you know if there's a zoom in feature in iMovie.
Ooh, that's a really good question. There has to be. I can't imagine there wouldn't be, but I have not personally used iMovie in a really long time. And it might be a percentage thing. It might say like transform zoom like 10% or something like that. There used to be a Ken Burns effect that was just nothing but like Zooms and stuff like that. But I don't know iMovie that well. I apologize.
Great, thank you. And then the last one that we have so far is if you have any intro and exit slide recommendations.
Ooh, excellent question. So what I always like to intro with is either something really interesting visually, like, maybe that close up of the ground, since she was going to talk about soil. Where was that? That was here. Like, to me, that's just a really nice shot, right? That would be a nice scene setter shot. Or if you're working with like an organization or a very specific topic, then maybe you want a graphic slide. Maybe you want something like, whatever event you're at or whatever organization you're talking about. Maybe they have a very specific logo. So you might want that for your slide. But I like starting a picture. As far as an outro, if you have a call to action, like you want them to go to a website, or you want them to like, check this out for more information or come to this event in the future, then you probably do want to have that as an outro slide. You can do that as a full screen thing, or you could do it as text over like another, striking visual towards the end, and just let that kind of linger for a little bit.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Tanya. We don't have anything else in the chat so far, and we also are a couple minutes out from 3 o'clock. So if you have any, closing thoughts, or anyone has any closing questions too, feel free to put those in the chat feature. Otherwise, Tanya, let us know if you have any finishing thoughts.
Sure. So so music might seem a little scary to try to include in your video, but it can really enhance things. You don't necessarily have to have music throughout. By no means think that you need to do that. Like if you're putting together a 3-minute video, it does not need to be wall-to-wall music. Sometimes you just have a little bit of music at the beginning and it fades out, and maybe another little bit at the end, or maybe a little bit here and there in a scene change. So music doesn't have to be throughout the video. Please don't ever think it has to be. You can have some nice natural sound. Maybe you record some great crickets or just other natural sound that really fits with your story, and that goes in there too.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, we've got one more question, and Lisa asks, sorry. What is your general recommendation for length of time someone's name or location should stay on the screen?
Oh, that's a good question. Long enough to read it. So if you put it up there and you have enough time to read it, that's the perfect length. Otherwise, 4 or 5 seconds is usually a good rule of thumb.
Okay, awesome. And Kyle had a recommendation about computer. He says, I recommend making sure the software you get is compatible with the graphics card in the computer. He had a great computer, but wasn't working because the software didn't match the graphics card.
That is an excellent point. And like before you download Adobe Premiere or anything else, usually it'll say like minimum tech specs and recommended tech specs. So the minimum means it will run on it, but recommended means it'll run better on it.
And another question, do you have any recommendations on where to find sound bites to use for free?
Sound bites like interviews or sound like music? So sound bites like interviews, that would be tricky. But music, there are some free production music websites out there.
Yeah, they specified they did mean music.
Oh, music. Okay, got it. Gosh, there was something called sounddogs.com. I don't know if it's still out there. It wasn't free, but it was fairly inexpensive. But I know I have seen some free production music. You pretty much just have to do a Google search. A lot of people put stuff on YouTube and let you download it that way. So I don't personally have a great recommendation because I tend to use like music libraries, but I know it's out there.
Yeah, someone said they use bensound.com as a good one if you're familiar with that one.
I haven't used it, but that's good to know.
Okay. All right, well, awesome. No more questions in the chat feature. Tanya, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation and a wonderful series. To everyone, this recording will be provided as well as the presentation that Tanya did as well. So be on the lookout for an email following the webinar with that information. And thank you everyone so much for joining us. And again, thank you for Tanya.
Thank you.
Okay, bye everyone. Take care.
Have fun making great videos.